Lovely. Well, it's good to see you all this morning. Excellent. Thank you, Mary. And worship was great this morning, wasn't it? These guys are great. It's been great to have a marvellous worship team. We're so fortunate in this church to have so many gifted people that sing and play and help us to enter into God's presence. So thank you, guys, for that. Excellent. Well, we're carrying on our current series, looking at some of the prophets and some Old Testament characters. And I must admit, this series, we've all had to, all the people that have done some teaching, have had to really dig deep. We've had to actually become proper preachers and actually proper teachers and actually explore and understand some of the characters that we're talking on. And so, you know, a bit of depth, a bit of meat. It's all good, isn't it? And today I'm going to be looking at Micah. And you might say, who is Micah? Well, we're not talking about Micah Richards, former footballer and Sky pundit, or the singer Micah. So, but we're actually going to be talking today about the prophet Micah, and look at who he was, and some of the statements, some of the prophetic words, some of the words that he shared that still are relevant to today. So, the book of Micah can be found in the back section of the Old Testament among the minor prophets. And there's nothing minor about this prophet other than the length of the book that bears his name. It's a very short book. And although we know little about him, we do know when and where he prophesied and the effect his prophecy continues to have on us today. His power as a prophet and call to turn away from sin and towards the Saviour continues to bring us hope and shape who we are as believers. In verse 1, we hear that Micah was from Moresheth, Gath, a village located near the border of Israel. It would have been considered in the country at the time. It was an agricultural area, not near any major cities. And this puts him in good company with the prophet Amos, who was a shepherd who took care of the sycamore fig trees, and I know Helen spoke about him a few weeks ago. Micah's ministry likely occurred late in the reign of Jotham and continued into the early years of King Hezekiah's reign. And this will place the book of Micah around 730, 690 BC. And although it can be easy for each one of us to think that when we look at the prophets in the Old Testament especially, that we think they come in order and that they're only there at that point in time and then another prophet takes over. But in reality, many of them lived and ministered at the same time. Micah is no different. He would have been a contemporary of three other prophets, Amos and Hosea, in the northern kingdom of Israel, and Isaiah in the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, if you know any prophets, they tend to be quite quirky individuals, as we've found out in recent weeks. And you can read some of the bizarre things that some of these prophets did as a symbolic act of what they felt God was saying to the nation. And a prophet is someone who publicly declares a message that they believe has come from God. And as a prophet I know really well, and he is a very quirky character, and he uses this analogy to help explain, and I think it does help explain the role of a prophet. Prophet is a little bit like a postman or a post lady or a post person. What's the proper term? Post. So many posts things. And they deliver a parcel or a letter. And a prophet's role is to make sure that the message is delivered to the right person at the right time. And like when we receive a letter or a parcel through the door, we check it, don't we? Has it come to the right address? And what's inside? Is it for us? And that's the same, really. A prophet's role is to deliver a message. To deliver a message to someone, to a nation, to a people group. And then it's down to that group to say, yes, I need to take that on board. That's for me. That's the right message for me. Is it correct? Is it for them? And Micah is known for bringing a message of judgment and restoration that would start a revival in the land of Judah. And among the prophets of the Old Testament, he's perhaps the most vocal in his demands of justice for the poor and the downtrodden. He lashes out at greedy judges who make money from unjust bribes while ignoring true justice and mercy. Yet the beauty of Micah's prophecy is that it assures us God will not end the story there. In fact, some of the most powerful, promising promises of restoration, hope and peace are spoken by Micah. And I'm going to pull out some of the most well-known verses from the book of Micah and look at how we can implement them into our everyday lives. So how are the words and prophecies of Micah, written 2,500 years ago, still relevant to us today? Well, firstly, one of the scriptures that you've probably heard of before, and we read this in Micah 4, verses 3 to 5. He will judge between many people, and he will settle disputes for strong nations far and wide. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not take up sword against nations, nor will they train for war anymore. Wow, that's a message that this world needs to hear, isn't it, today? Peace is something we long for. We live in a world that is far from it. And one of my heroes is a guy called Shane Claiborne. Some of you might have heard of him. He wrote a great book. He's written many books, but written a great book called The Irresistible Revolution. And if you want to be challenged and inspired about how social justice takes place, how this guy lives in community in a real tough part of America, it's a great book. I'd recommend it, really would. Shane Claiborne is a Christian activist and author. He's also one of the founders of the non-profit organisation The Simple Way in Philadelphia. He's a social activist advocating for non-violence and service to the poor. And I'd suggest he's a bit of a modern-day Micah too. And I just want to show you this picture. Instead of swords into plowshares, he's actively promoting a project called Guns into Garden Tools and challenging the gun culture in America. And you can see a picture of him there with half of an AK-47, the other half the other guy's holding, and it's been chopped in half. And incredible, the whole idea of concept about beating guns, hope for people who are weary of violence. And this is some of them tools that have been made. This is what an AK-47 looks like after it's been transformed, turned into a shovel and a pitchfork. It's great, isn't it? So taking guns that have been used, obviously for violence, that have been confiscated or found or used, that have been handed in, and they're turned around for something of peace. Another powerful prophecy from Micah is one that we hear every year at Christmas, the one that tells us that the birth of Christ would occur in Bethlehem. It says in Micah 5:2, "But you, Bethlehem, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will rule over Israel, whose origins are far from old, from ancient times." And over 700 years later, this prophecy would be fulfilled the night that Jesus was born. But the verse I want to focus on today, and we'll break it down a little bit step by step, is this one, which is taken from Micah 6 verse 8. "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Once again, this was a message to God's people over 2,500 years ago, but it's still a message that I believe God would want us to take on board and to be involved with today. To act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly before our God. So we're going to focus a bit more on these three statements, and firstly, going to look at act justly or do justice. So what does it mean to do justice? And there's a bit of a quote there on the bottom. "Social justice is love applied to systems, policies, and cultures." God tells us to do justice. And perhaps we might struggle with this terminology. What does it look like? When we think of the word justice, many of us conjure up images of a courtroom with a judge, lawyers, solicitors, witnesses, and a jury. Simply put, we usually just think of justice as being a punishment for wrongdoing. Someone's committed a crime, they receive a punishment, justice is served. But acting justly involves being just and doing justice. The definition of justice is to create a world where all people have an equal opportunity. And using from a Christian perspective, to create a world where all people have equal opportunities to fully develop the gifts that God has placed within them. We all have a part to play. All of us are people that can make a difference. We see injustice every day. Inequality in its widest sense. Racial inequality, gender inequality, the poor and rich divide. And there's an article that came out from a very big survey that was done. It was in the news last week. So out of the 307 places or towns, cities across the country, it was marking out which was the most unhealthiest place to live. And does anybody know what the unhealthiest place might be? It's actually Liverpool and Blackpool. There you go. So if you go to Blackpool and you buy your Kiss Me Quick hat, just be careful, because it's not very healthy, unfortunately. But sadly, Sandwell, out of 307 places, Sandwell comes 296th. So we're really down the pile, guys, of an unhealthy place to live. And sadly, health is always linked to poverty, always. So in all of the places we've mentioned where we see not great healthcare or people just not eating or living healthily, it's always linked down to poverty. And when we talk about justice, it's about how do we change some of that. And you might think, well, that's too big a task. But we can change. We can change. Even in our own little setting, we can make a difference. Justice is about creating a level playing field and providing equal opportunities for all. We want a level playing field, don't we? It shouldn't be that we've got these big, massive divides in our nation. Places that are living in poverty and other places of affluence. Surely we should have a level playing field. In our daily lives, we all have the opportunity to do justice with actions that help people help themselves. In this, we are creating an environment where people can thrive and achieve their full potential. The word used for justice throughout the Bible and in Micah is a word called Mismatch, and it's used more than 200 times. And it's often to speak about the idea, its concept, its meaning is the idea of treating all people fairly as they deserve, being created in the image of God. And that when we look at other people from other cultures, other backgrounds, people that are different to us, everybody is made in the image of God. And that has to be a level playing field, doesn't it? It has to be. And God is calling us to break down unjust systems and restore dignity to the downtrodden. Some very powerful statements. I'm just going to read a few of them out. Martin Luther King Jr. said this: "We need leaders not in love with money, but in love with justice. Not in love with publicity, but in love with humanity." A great quote, isn't it? Another quote here: "If Christians claim to be concerned for their neighbours, then they must also be concerned about the structures and systems that inhibit their neighbours' flourishing." So we can look at someone, we can engage with someone, and we can be concerned and say, oh, we'll love our neighbour. But if we're not concerned about the structures and systems, then that is a big problem, isn't it? We need to be people that are changers, that are game changers for people that are living in poverty. And we can all do our little bit. Warm Spaces is one of those, isn't it? We're actually doing this. This is an opportunity to get involved in some justice and to bring a level playing field for some people. True biblical mishpat is when the problems of the vulnerable become my problems. When we're not hungry for justice, it's usually because we're too full with privilege. Some challenging statements, so sorry if you're feeling slightly, I came to church to become happy today. But, so often we can get full with privilege that we don't see the justice around us. Privilege is when you think something is not a problem because you aren't affected personally. It's easy for us, isn't it, just to go through life and put our blinkers on, but yet God is asking us to recognise where there is injustice in our world. Realising there is injustice, caring and doing something about it are the first steps to bringing meaningful change. Throughout the Old Testament, it's clear that God cared for the vulnerable. This is what the Lord Almighty said: "Administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless or the foreigner or the poor." And we hear that in Zechariah. Justice for the vulnerable isn't just an Old Testament concept. We're all familiar with Jesus in the temple, and he speaks out the words of Isaiah: "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim liberty, freedom to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. Jesus stands up and just declares these words that were said by the prophet Isaiah. It's so very clear that God is for the forgotten, the beat down, the shut out, and the left behind. God's desire for us is to have an active faith. It's clear he's not interested in just us sitting here today in church on a Sunday. He's more interested about our presence working in our community the rest of the week. The verses before Micah 6:8 that we're focusing on hits the nail on the head. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? No, God doesn't desire our worship as much as he desires our obedience, to love the world that we've been placed in. A closer walk with Christ means that we care deeply about issues of injustice in our community and in our world. Micah 6 makes it clear that we need to place an active role. We need to play an active role in our community. Recognise injustice and then work actively to correct it. The next part of this verse, love mercy. Love mercy is also one of the most challenging verses, speaking directly to the heart of the issues we are facing today. And I love these statements. Mercy is the compassionate treatment of those in need, especially when it is within one's power to punish or harm them. So if we're in a really strong position, and we could do a whole range of things to those that are in poverty, that are oppressed, but yet we decide to have mercy. The command to love mercy can also be translated to love kindness. And these Bible verses show us how it delights God when we are kind and merciful. Take mercy or kindness. The Hebrew word used here is hesed, and it's much richer in many forms than anything the English language could offer. And that's like a lot of words, isn't it? When you unpack the real meaning, it's a lot richer than our word that we've got for mercy. When you unpack this word, when you really understand what it means, it's often translated as faithfulness, steadfast love, kindness, loving kindness, or mercy. It's all of these things rolled into one. Interestingly, we're not called to be merciful, even though we are, but it's not just that, it's about loving mercy. Interesting, isn't it? To love mercy is when you love something, you're willing to sacrifice for it, give up your time for it, protect it, put it before yourself. When you love something that much, you're passionate about it. We're called to love mercy. Mercy is not getting what we deserve. God has shown us such immense mercy, and the obvious response is to show mercy to others. We took communion today, and that's recognising mercy. God's mercy when he sacrificed his son on the cross to pay for our sins, for all of the stuff we've done wrong. We deserved to be punished, and yet God said, because of my grace and my mercy, you're forgiven. And we need to be people that love that concept, love mercy, so much so that we're wanting to tell others about it. We're wanting to sacrifice. We're wanting to do all we can for the sake of mercy. And finally, walk humbly. Walk humbly with God recognises the poverty of mind, soul, spirit and body, and that we all possess without the grace of God. It means having a full reliance on God, not ourselves. And I want you to think about the literal act of walking with someone and imagining walking humbly with them. You're talking to them, listening to them, interacting with them. And if you're walking humbly, chances are you're not walking around judging them or having your chest puffed out thinking that you're more superior, looking down your nose at people. That isn't walking humbly with people, is it? And we're called to engage in this world and walk humbly. A powerful statement. How we walk with the broken speaks louder than how we sit with the great. You know, our culture is that we want to be with those people of influence, those people that change things, that are popular, that are famous. And we've all got a bit of that. But what God's interested in is walking with the broken. How we sit with those We look at Jesus' life, he modelled this, didn't he? Yes, he met with the religious leaders, but he spent most of his time with the downtrodden, with the brokenhearted. That's what this life is about. You know, as a chaplain, one of the things that I learned, someone said a really powerful statement as a football chaplain, and as you know, I do chaplain at Aston Villa, chaplaincy, and one of the things that I learned really early on, they said, you know, don't just try and be a chaplain to all of the players and all of the famous ones. What about being a chaplain to the guy on the door, the chef, the whoever it is in a football club? Because actually, when it's a holistic role, I know Mary does this and other people that are involved in chaplaincy, it isn't just about targeting those people of influence, it's about everybody, isn't it? How we walk with the broken speaks louder than how we sit with the great. We need to see people through God's eyes, not through how the world sees them. Walking humbly with God means we have to have a full reliance on him, not ourselves. This can all feel very overwhelming, this whole theme today. But you know, ultimately, we just walk humbly with God and allow him to work through us. We need to have a full reliance on him, not ourselves. And today we're living in a moment begging for that kind of response. God, we can't fix this world. We can do our bit, but we can't do it all. We need you. Lord, break our hearts for what breaks yours. The adverb humbly moves us away from arrogance and the need to always be better than others to the simple acceptance of God's grace. Humility is essential to recognizing and accepting our total dependence on God. God has given us everything today, even the gift of life. Alf mentioned it this morning. We woke up today, didn't we? And without God's grace and Christ's sacrifice on the cross, we would be separated from him. So let's walk humbly, remembering what God has done in our lives. And that really will affect the way that we treat others. So, just to finish, God calls us to act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with our families, in our communities, and in this world. And in the Talmud, which is a compilation of Jewish ancient teachings, I love this phrase. It says, do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief, because there's a lot of it around, isn't there? What does God ask us to do? Do justly now. Small steps. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You're not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. It's true, isn't it? God calls us to do this, but we can't save the world. We can't do it, but we can do our little bit. We can do our little bit in our families, in our communities, in our streets, in our work, in our towns. Let's not be daunted because we have a great big God. That's God's job. God just calls us to do justly, seek out justice wherever we are, love mercy, recognize God's grace is the great gift that God gives each one of us. And let's love that. Walk humbly, recognizing our need of him just as much as everybody else. We cannot be an observer, but we need to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly. And I want us to say maybe this prayer together. Yeah. And I want you to read it first, because I won't ask you to pray something that you haven't read. But in the world we live in, it's so hard, isn't it, to channel our anger. We can get weighed down by life and the world we live in. And you know, all of this is about love. God's great love for us. Keep my anger from becoming meanness. Keep my sorrow from collapsing into self-pity. Keep my heart soft enough to keep breaking. Keep my anger turned towards justice, not cruelty. Remind me that all of this, every bit of this, is for love. I like this. Keep me fiercely kind. Today, if that's all we do, if that's the line you take away from today, be fiercely kind. When you're fierce, you're in someone's face, aren't you? But it's kind. You're modeling kindness. You're doing everything to present God to others by being fiercely kind. So can we say that together? Is that all right if you're still awake? If you want to, let's pray this prayer together. Let's pray. God, keep my anger from becoming meanness. Keep my sorrow from collapsing into self-pity. Keep my heart soft enough to keep breaking. Keep my anger turned towards justice, not cruelty. Remind me that all of this, every bit of it, is for love. Keep me fiercely kind. Amen. Amen. Bless you all.